There we go. All right. I don't know how that volume is, but I think that volume is probably good. One of the things about this on YouTube is that it doesn't tell me how good my volume is on little microphone doodads, so that's fine. I'm sure people will let me know if they can or cannot hear me. I have my hot beverage of choice. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to send this out to the Facebook and the Twitter, and then if I can figure out where to find that, maybe I won't. Can I figure out where to find the video? Oh, we'll do it this way, and then I'll send the video out when it's done. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to try to talk. It's really hard for me to do three things at once. That's the problem with doing all the things on the internet. Um, Good morning, everyone. I hope everything is going well for you while I post this. And basically, what I'm doing is that these are a series of talks about art practice as a theater person, as a theater artist, as a playwright. And this is also me talking about Cobblestone Kingdom, which is a project that I'm going to be having a Kickstarter for. And it's really a gay version of Cinderella, a proper gay version, where it's not just a retread of the Disney movie. It's not just a new version of Ever After, um, which is that great Drew Barrymore Cinderella film. It's not. It's as much its own thing as you can be when you're really adapting a very classic fairy tale, I guess I will say. I don't think there's any issue with necessarily adapting anything either. I think it's important to honor the stories that we have that we're familiar with while bringing something new to them. And that's what I'm attempting really to do. That's what this art practice is all about. It's about creating a queer fairy tale, but it's also about giving roles to actors that are queer. Um, Cobblestone Kingdom, as I've said in the past, is written to have as few gender pronouns concretely as possible. Like it's written so trans actors can fit most of the roles. Some of them are gendered. It was surprising how much gendered language I actually had to watch while I was writing it. Um, but you'll see that hopefully when it comes out. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about villains and magic in the universe. I'm not sure how long this is going to take. I've been trying to roll some ideas around in my head, but we'll see what pops out of my mouth because that is generally how it works with me. So there are a few villains in the movie. I didn't want to do a stepmother, but I still wanted to do the kind of system that keeps Cinderella down in a way. Into the Woods, it's not as prevalent in Into the Woods because Cinderella isn't really main character until Act Two in a way. Um, and she's in the whole play and she has a lot to do, but I don't know that I consider her main character until Act Two, until everything changes when the giant comes. But there's kind of the system of oppression that keeps her down, and there's something about that system that I found interesting, but I didn't just want to make it like this abusive thing like what you see in most Cinderella adaptations. I actually really liked kind of what they did in Ever After, where instead of that traditional fairy godmother, they brought in a great artist painter of the time to create the outfit and be the fairy godmother type, but not have that. And so I kind of figured out a way to take the elements that were hardest in Cinderella for me to take, which was the abusive nature of the stepmom, and turn it into something where it made sense for me. It made sense for how I like to view the world and magic. And it made sense for dealing with a script in which there's still, a monarchy and there's still a system in power that is very well accepted. And I think for me, the important thing was that Seven, who is my Cinderella analog, that Seven have a path for moving on in the world, and they don't take it necessarily. And throughout the course of the first act, especially, you kind of figure out why. Um, I talk a little bit about it, about the idea of grief, about the idea of waiting and longing. And I think longing and grief are both parts of the queer experience that are very under um, represented in media. I think Love Simon did it really well. I think Perks of Being a Wallflower did it really well. And so I wanted to do that here. I also really, that's also my least favorite part of the Disney Cinderella is the moment when the stepsisters are like ripping her dress to shreds, and it's very violent. I was set to fast forward through that, so I didn't want that. I didn't want it to be just kind of a tale of overcoming abuse, which is good. It's good that those tales exist because people really need that, but that's not the story I wanted to tell. So I had to, in the first draft of it, Marceline existed, but she was very different. And as the story has unfolded and I've gotten better at writing and better at saying exactly what I want when I want, which is something you have to learn as a playwright, Marceline really changed. In the beginning, her motivations were not quite as clear, and I feel like in this draft, especially in this kind of fully polished, realized version 3, what she wants is really on display. The idea of the prince being a means to an end of a takeover, of her being the knight, of her being related to the ravens, who are the kind of evil wizards of the place that have, well, they think they pulled the wool over the king and queen's eyes. And for me, it was important to have Marceline be unrepentant bad. And I think this is interesting because we went through this big thing in pop culture, especially of making villains really relatable and like giving them these backstories and things like that. Once Upon a Time did this, the Cruella movie did this. It was a whole thing for quite a while, even up until recently, really. But you start to see in the Marvel Universe, especially with a character like Loki, where you see the audience can handle people that are just, I don't want to say bad, because Loki is not bad, Loki is chaotic. So I'll say people have started to learn how to handle monsters that are just monsters. I think it goes back to, it kind of started with Buffy, with the first, or the master, or whoever the head vampire was in season 1. But we kind of started to finally get away from every villain has to be sympathetic, and some people can just be villains. And I really like that, especially for a fairy tale. There are some things that I've written where the villain is more complex, if they exist at all in physical form. And a complex villain is also really important, but I think for a fairy tale narrative, you need your villain to be a villain. And honestly, it's just more fun to write sometimes that way, to write a villain that is scheming and has a very clear desire that is very well telegraphed to the audience and maybe not to all the characters otherwise. And I think that's really important to me, um, to have had fun while doing this. Because I think there's a lot of whimsy in the Cinderella narrative, especially in the versions Broadway has done. And I wanted to have that whimsy as well. I wanted that in the magic. And I wanted that in my villain. So Marceline kind of is this unrepentant alto, for lack of better distinction. I really kind of wanted to make her one of those Broadway quote unquote brassy broads, which I'm not sure if I like that phrase, but I like the sentiment. It was really important to me that Marceline matched the eccentricity of Mr. and Mrs. Raven, who are the wizards, who are the evil wizards. And they are very eccentric. They are very out there personality wise, and I needed her to be that strong. I needed it to be, with the reveals in the third act, I needed her to be strong in her own way. And I wanted her to be strong in her own way anyways, because I wanted Marceline to take charge of the situation she is in. And so I had to write a character that was strong, that could match the energy of the other people, but also have kind of her own unique wickedness. And I'm saying her. I would like Marceline to be played by a female presenting person, but Marceline could easily be they, them. I don't think there are any pronouns for Marceline in the script. I envision Marceline as this really great brunette with heavy lids, very Marlene Dietrich, very oh god, I can't remember her name. But very kind of old school Hollywood glamour, with those thin arched eyebrows and that really great kind of blinked angry face kind of thing. Um, yeah, and so it was important to me to have a character that was simply villainous, that understood the world in which they lived and the world of magic. I don't, even though it costs some production values to do it, I don't shy away from actual magic in the world of magic. And I feel like some Cinderella versions so focused on love story they lost that, like the Hilary Duff version that led to a whole bunch of like Disney-fied Cinderella sequels, Cinderella story movies. But I think part of what makes Cinderella good is the magic, and even in the Disney version in the 50s, you see that magic in certain places, and Sing Sweet Nightingale especially. So magic doesn't always have to be like physical magic embodied in things. And in this version of Cinderella, there is physical magic embodied into stuff. I mean, we've got sprites, there are magic fireworks at a certain point, if I can get a handle on that. But there's something out of fairy tale that invites the idea of magic and the idea of otherness, and that's just another bit of queerness that I really like in it. Um, and it's really important to me that there's always elements of otherness in my work, but especially in something where magic is so big and important to the story itself. I feel that was one of the things um, the '97 Cinderella with Brandy and Winnie Houston did really well, but also not as well, because there's a lot of time where there's a really great color palette, but there's no sense of magic to it, and it's a sense of hurrying towards the story. And I struggled with this a little bit in writing this, was the idea of hurrying towards the romance. It took me a while to figure out how to set the scene and not have it be either exhaustive or non-existent. Um, and Marceline was a struggle in that. Like, Marceline was always a part of it. The Ravens weren't always a part of it. Um, and it was really complex. It's really complex to write because you have to really kind of straddle a few lines to make sure you tell a cohesive story that's both kind of expected in the Cinderella narrative. Because when I say a gay Cinderella fairy tale to some people, they have expectations of what that means to have it be Cinderella, and but also to put, your stamp on it. And it's important to me that this isn't just, Cinderella but with two dudes, which is great. I mean, there's a place for that, but that's not what what I'm writing. I am writing that, but it's so much more. It's more complex. Marceline wants these things, and they're not an empty want. She has desires, and there's a little bit of conflict within her desires, but they're not empty desires. She doesn't just want them because she's the villain. She wants them because to her they mean something. And I never want to write a script where I convey anything less than that, anyways. Um, yeah, and what's really interesting about doing magic in a live setting too is, unlike a film or a claymation venture or something like that, this is something where you actually have to think about it and plan how you're going to do it. So it's both not $1 million, and it's both something the audience can signify as what it is. Um, and it was really hard for me in the beginning of my career to just write in what I wanted and go, I'll figure out how to actually make it happen later for when this gets funded. But I've come to peace with that, um, because you get really stuck if you start thinking about how much things will cost. You just kind of have to write and hope. And I think Cobblestone Kingdom will be a very beautiful story. I'm really excited about this Kickstarter, about the idea of crowdfunding for something. No, I've never done something like this before, and I'm really putting myself out there, and I'm more nervous about it than I let on. Um, I think for me, the story is really important to tell. I think being openly gay, we haven't really had a lot of fairy tales of our own. Like we've imprinted on very gay versions of Cinderella. We've imprinted on, the pastiche of A Knight's Tale. We've imprinted on Ella Enchanted and 13 Going on 30. But we don't really have that on our own, and I think it's really important that we have that. And I'm not saying I obviously would like this to really take off and that people really resound with it. And I'm not saying automatically it will, but I'm hoping it will. For me, the fact that people still have to write fan fiction for stories because there's no representation is, problematic. And I want people to be able to be a part of this, knowing that they're as represented as I could make them. And granted, I have a lot of privilege, so it's not perfect. And granted, the Cinderella narrative is not perfect. But for me, and for who I am, and for where I am in my life, I'm really excited to share this with you. I'm really excited to share the magic with you, the vocals, the duets. I'm really excited for you to watch the prince and their Cinderella kiss, or the princess and their Cinderella kiss. I want it to be so good that people cheer at the end of the second act and then realize there's a whole other act to go because it's not done. But I don't think I'm alone in that as a theater artist. I also think what's going to be an interesting challenge in this, and I wrote this down, I didn't talk about it yet, was the idea of um, villains are usually queer coded. Tim Curry is the butler in Clue, Loki in this point. Um, the Green Goblin, probably I would say in most versions of Spider-Man, is queer coded. Um, a lot of villains are queer coded. And so, what happens when you have that kind of villain with a queer sensibility in a queer production where they're no longer coded because everything is just stone cold gay? Uh, it's something that's really interesting to see because then it becomes less about their queerness and more about the villainy. And I think that's really cool. And I really hope that whoever I cast understands that vibe because I'm going to be very explicit about it. Um, so I think it's going to be really interesting because there are a lot of queer coded villains because villains have always been coded queer because other is always coded, really, right? So when I say queer coded, I mean when you think about villains, let's say in the Batman universe, the male villains tend to be effeminate, the female villains tend to be more butch or dominant. You look at Joker, Catwoman, the Riddler, especially look at those three. Um, so in that queer coding is the idea that queer equals bad, and so we have to make them the villain. Um, but luckily that has changed. Luckily that's not as big a thing anymore. But queer coding still exists, and it just exists because it's so ingrained, and sometimes people don't even know they're doing it until it's way too late. Um, and so I think as a queer artist wrestling, especially in this Cinderella narrative with the idea of queer coding, um, Marceline is a villain who is very much a Rousey Broad in the Broadway tradition, which again I don't know if I like that phrase, but it's a good sentiment for what I want to do. And I think it's important to recognize that queer coding still exists and to take that and kind of examine it a little bit, not fully in this because we don't have that kind of time. Broadway productions are already lengthy things. Oh, sorry, I needed something to drink after that. Um, yeah, and so struggling with how to keep the queerness without making it so much about that classic villain queer coding. There is some of that. There's a really great opening scene with Marceline. There's Marceline enters to Thunder and Lightning, and there's a comment made about it, and it's like that's one of those wonderful yet silly things that I could both put in and I could poke at. as a trope, and I think it was really great. And I'm very excited to share it with you, and I hope that you will come to cherish Cobblestone Kingdom as much as I have, and I hope that we'll get to a point where I won't have to say Cobblestone Kingdom based on the story of Cinderella. But when I say Cobblestone Kingdom, people will be like, "Oh yeah, I remember that. That's the play you wrote, with the really cool scene and this and this." And that's my goal. That's my hope. Yeah, and this one is a little bit of a shorter stream because it's still kind of the Christmas holiday, and I know people are not quite back to work yet. This is kind of like the Fat Tuesday of holidays, where between Christmas and New Year's, everyone's kind of all scattered about. Um, but it was really important for me in my art practice and to keep people abreast of this. And I think for anyone that watches these videos afterwards, that knows the outcome in the future of this and gets to see the work, you can look back on this and say, "Oh God, why is he talking and rambling on?" Um, it matters a lot to me, not just because I'll be directing it, unless I find someone that really just wants to take on the project, but because the idea of a queer fairy tale both is something you think, well, God, we already have that, right? But it's also something that just doesn't exist because really we've had to imprint on a lot of narratives that could have been written kind of catered to us, but more to the point we're not. And we love them. Like the 97 Cinderella broadcast with Brandy Minnie Houston is amazing, and I love it, and I'm grateful for it. But it's not gay. It's really not. I mean, it's fantastic. It's campy, and there's a lot of great things about camp that are very queer because that is at its essence an examination of what makes things normalized, what makes things other. But I want to put out in the world a story of a Cinderella and a prince that are both male presenting, kissing, or a Cinderella and a prince that are sapphic and make it a sapphic love story if two female leads end up getting cast. Two female presenting leads end up getting cast. I want this to not just be another musical that is happening, that is an adaptation of something. This means something to me in a way that I am not sure I can really express because sometimes I don't know it until it happens. Anyone that knows me knows that I didn't really think Love, Simon was that important for my personal queer journey until I saw it and I started tearing up in theater. um, so I'm hoping that it'll be not just a great queer experience, but that it'll be fun for people. That people will have fun and will enjoy themselves because we don't do that enough in life. Life is a difficult journey for a lot of us. And if I can give people joy for a few hours and something to cheer about and wonderful, beautiful love story beginning to follow, I want to do that. And that's all I'm going to say today because I can hear myself starting to ramble on about the project. Yeah, but so that was what I want to talk about. I want to talk about Marceline a little bit because I haven't really touched on the villains. And Mr. and Mrs. Raven are the other villains, of course, and they're all connected. But explaining that would explain part of the story, and I don't know how much I want to do that. And that's going to be all for the stream for today. If you have any questions, comments, anything you need, feel free to leave that in the chat. I think the chat stays on, or comment, and I'll answer them, or I'll make them the story of the next video. We got a few more of these before the Kickstarter kicks off sometime in early-ish January, sometime after the first. My goal is the 11th, but I don't know how much I'm going to hit that. And yeah, so that's all I have to say, and I hope everyone has a great day. Bye.